The child's voice barely carried past her cracked lips. "They sold me because I was blind." The man on horseback broad as the chapel wall and still as the grave heard the words and didn't speak right away. He looked down at the little girl curled beside the old well, her bare feet cut and bleeding, her thin dress clinging to her like paper. Her hair, the color of dusk, was matted with dust and twigs. She didn't lift her head. She didn't need to. He dismounted slowly like a man who knew the earth too well to rush. His boots made almost no sound on the packed dirt. The sun had not fully risen, but the air already carried heat. He crouched beside her, his wide shadow falling over her like a shelter. The girl flinched at first, but didn't pull away. Her hand trembled as it gripped the wooden rim of the well, her small fingers seeking the worn groove where so many had rested before her. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since yesterday morning," she whispered. The man looked toward the silent cluster of homes on the hill Santado, a settlement built on stolen land and borrowed time. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but no one had come looking for the child. "Name?" he asked. "Lucinda." "That your real name?" "It's the one my mama gave me." Before she died, he nodded once and reached into his saddlebag. Dried meat wrapped in cloth, a small leather flask of water. He offered them both without a word. She took the water first, holding it with both hands as if it might vanish. She drank slow, then slower, until her breathing settled. He stayed crouched beside her, didn't ask more. After she ate, she leaned her head against the well and said, "I followed the sound of the creek. Mama said it sings different in summer, and when the wind changes pitch through the canyon, you're near home." He didn't correct her. She wasn't home. Not anymore. "What's your name?" she asked. "Nantan." "That Apache?" "Yes. They used to say that like a curse here." "I know." Silence returned, the way it does when two strangers decide not to be strangers anymore. He noticed the faint marks on her arms, old bruises, some fresher than others. She didn't speak of them, and he didn't ask. "You ride far?" she asked after a while. "Far enough? You gonna keep going?" He didn't answer that one. The well beside them creaked as the wind shifted. A shutter slammed on a distant window, and a dog barked twice before falling quiet. But no doors opened, no voices called out. Nantan stood. His height startled the eye tall as a pine and built like something carved from red canyon rock. He pulled a blanket from his saddle and laid it beside her. "For the night," he said, "I'll stay close." Lucinda didn't speak again, just curled onto the blanket, clutching the remains of the jerky like a talisman. He sat beside the well, his back to the stone, his face turned toward the town that had forgotten its own child. He didn't sleep. The stars came out one by one, then all at once. Coyotes called far off in the hills. A window lit briefly, then darkened again. Santado settled into its nighttime silence. Near dawn, the chapel bell rang once, an old habit of the town's priest. It wasn't long after that when the first murmurs reached them. From behind lace curtains and cracked door frames, eyes began to notice. A few townsfolk whispered, a child sleeping by the well, and beside her a giant Apache. Mary Elizabeth was the first to step outside, her apron dusted with flour, her face lined with age and worry. She stood frozen in the street for a long moment, then made her way to the chapel. Soon after, two more women gathered in front of the general store, hands folded tightly in front of them, watching. Then someone sent a boy to fetch Simon Harris. Lucinda stirred under the blanket as footsteps neared. Nantan rose slowly. Not threatening, just steady. The way a man stands who's lived too long being misjudged. His hand didn't go to the knife on his hip, but he knew where it was. "Morning," Mary Elizabeth said, stepping into the small circle of quiet. "Ma'am," he nodded. She looked down at the girl, who now blinked into the sunrise, unseeing but aware. "You're Lucinda Esperanza," the woman said gently. "I helped deliver you." Lucinda sat up, tugging the blanket around her. "I came back," she said simply. "You weren't supposed to." Lucinda's chin lifted slightly. "I had nowhere else." Mary Elizabeth sighed and knelt beside her, pulling something from her apron pocket. A small piece of warm tortilla. She pressed it into Lucinda's hand without a word. The girl held it like a treasure. Mary Elizabeth looked up at Nantan. Her gaze didn't hold fear, just questions. "You stay with her. All night. She sleep. Better than before." Mary Elizabeth exhaled slowly, a sound like weariness wrapped in gratitude. "They'll come," she said. "I know." A commotion broke out by the store. Simon Harris had arrived. He was dressed like a man in control-clean vest, silver belt buckle, boots too polished for dirt. His voice carried across the plaza. "There's an Apache sitting by the well with a child in his shadow," he barked. "Anyone want to explain that?" No one answered. "I want them gone by sundown," Simon said louder. Lucinda stood on shaky legs, the blanket still around her, the tortilla half-eaten in her hand. "I heard you," she said. Simon blinked. "I heard you that night. Behind the corn sacks. You lost all your silver playing cards. You said I was the only thing left you could pay with." The silence that followed was a slap. Mary Elizabeth rose to her feet beside Lucinda, her jaw tight. Nantan didn't move. He didn't have to. A man named Arthur, the old carpenter, stepped into the edge of the square. He'd built half the porches in Santiago and fixed the roof of the chapel twice. "If what the girl says is true," Arthur said slowly, "we've got more to talk about than just where she sleeps." Simon's mouth opened, but no words came. The wind changed. The morning sun rose a little higher. And all across Santiago, people realized they weren't just looking at a blind girl and a quiet Apache. They were looking at the truth. And it wasn't going anywhere. The first morning sun had barely cleared the canyon rim when Lucinda stepped into the dirt path that led deeper into Santiago. Her feet, still bruised from 3 days of walking, felt every pebble. But she didn't falter. She could hear the town waking chickens clucking in wire pens, the metallic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, a wagon wheel creaking in protest as someone rolled across packed earth. To anyone else, it was just noise. To Lucinda, it was a map of home. Only it didn't feel like home anymore. She paused near the bakery, where the smell of rising dough used to drift into the streets. The shutters were closed. She heard someone step close, then retreat. A murmur. Then the door slammed shut. Lucinda turned toward the general store. Nothing. No voice called her name. No one asked where she'd been or how she'd survived. "I came back," she said aloud. But the town answered with silence. Mary Elizabeth found her near the chapel steps. The old midwife was carrying a basket of linens, her back bent from years of work, her eyes sharp as ever. "Child," she whispered, surprised. You're alive." Lucinda nodded, her hand resting on the stone wall for balance. "I walked back," she said. "Mama taught me how." I followed the creek, the wind, the birds. Mary Elizabeth set the basket down and moved slowly toward her. She took the girl's hand, felt the cracked skin, the rawness of the soles. "Lord, help us," she said under her breath. "You came all that way, alone?" Lucinda gave a half shrug. "People don't always come back from being thrown out," Mary Elizabeth muttered. "Most don't." Lucinda reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, rock-smooth, flat worm from her palm. She handed it to the midwife. "I used this to listen. When I dropped it, I'd hear where it landed, dirt or stone, hollow or echo." Mary Elizabeth didn't speak for a long moment. Then she reached into her apron and pressed a small piece of still warm bread into Lucinda's hand. "You'll eat," she said softly. You'll eat, and then we'll figure out what happens next. Lucinda chewed slowly, tasting salt, though she couldn't tell if it was from the bread or her own tears. Mary Elizabeth's hands fussed at her tangled hair, smoothing it, muttering apologies under her breath for letting things go this far. That evening, as the sun fell low over the hills, Nantan returned from scouting water near the canyon. Lucinda was sitting beneath the chapel bell, her back straight, her chin lifted. They won't talk to me, she said when she heard his steps. They fear what they don't understand, he answered. No, she corrected. They fear what they ignored. He sat beside her, long legs folded. The bells above them were rusted but still hummed faintly in the wind. She turned toward him, listening for his breath, the slow rise and fall she'd come to recognize. I remember everything, she said. Tell me. Lucinda clutched the string around her neck, the one that held her mother's pendant, a simple copper charm shaped like a dove. I was hiding. Behind the corn sacks. The night before they took me, Nantan didn't speak. He let the story come in its own time. Simon Harris was drunk. He owed money. 3 men came into the barn. One asked how he was going to pay. He said he was out of silver, out of horses, but had one thing left. She paused, her voice tightening. He said, the blind one. Take her. She won't fetch much, but it'll cover tonight's losses. Nantan's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. Lucinda leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. She pressed her forehead against her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was brittle. They took me the next morning. No one stopped them. No one even asked where I went. Nantan looked toward the town. Lights flickered in windows. Voices drifted from porches, but none came close. He is the head man here? He asked. Lucinda nodded. Yes. He decides who belongs, who doesn't. Nantan's fingers curled around a small stone near his boot. He rolled it between his thumb and palm, slowly. You told me your mother died during the harvest. She had fever. We had no money for a doctor. She said, Mija, people fear what they don't understand. Don't let their fear become your shame. Your mother was wise. Lucinda smiled faintly, a crooked thing that didn't reach her eyes. She thought they'd care for me, that someone would take me in, but no one did. That night, a fire crackled behind Mary Elizabeth's home. The old woman had quietly offered a place near her garden for Lucinda to sleep. She gave no grand speeches, no promises, just a blanket and a bowl of lentils. Nantan sat beside the garden gate, his arms crossed, watching the shadows move along the wall. He didn't ask for shelter. He didn't need it. He stayed for her. But in the plaza, under the wide oaks, whispers grew louder. She's back? After what happened? Did she bring him with her? A blind child and an Apache. Trouble walks on 2 sets of feet. The words spread like wildfire. By morning, Simon Harris had called a town meeting. The message went out, all household heads to gather at sundown. Chapel steps. The reason, spoken quietly and with purpose, the girl has returned, and she's brought shame with her. That afternoon, Lucinda sat in the corner of Mary Elizabeth's kitchen, rolling clay between her palms. It had no form yet. Just a lump, waiting. Mary Elizabeth stirred stew at the hearth. Her voice was soft. Some of the women say what happened to you was wrong. Lucinda's hands stilled. But they also say speaking up might bring more trouble. Lucinda didn't answer. Mary Elizabeth continued. Elena Vasquez told her husband, if they make that child leave again, I'll never forgive him. But the men, they're afraid, Lucinda finished. Yes. Lucinda returned to shaping the clay. What are they afraid of? She asked. Change, Mary Elizabeth said. Truth. The kind that costs you comfort. Outside, voices began gathering, the sound of boots in dirt, the metallic echo of the chapel bell. The town was assembling. Lucinda set the clay bowl aside and stood. Nantan was already waiting by the door. "You don't have to go," Mary Elizabeth told her. "I do," Lucinda said. Her voice was small, but steady. She reached for Nantan's hand, and together they walked out into a town ready to decide if it had a soul left to save. The bell on the chapel roof rang once, loud and clear, echoing across the dirt streets and wooden porches of Santado. People came slowly at first, then in groups, men in dust-worn vests and women in faded shawls, muttering beneath their breath. Children were pulled inside, shutters closed with more haste than usual. The plaza filled with bodies, but not with welcome. Lucinda stood just beyond the circle of light, her hand resting on Nantan's arm. The air smelled of dry earth and tension. She could hear the scrape of boots, the weight of breath being held too long. The town had gathered not for justice, but judgment. Simon Harris stood on the chapel steps, chest puffed and hands behind his back. He looked every inch the headman polished boots, ironed collar, eyes sharp with performance. A man rehearsing his defense before anyone had spoken a word. "She has no place here," Simon said to the crowd. "Whatever pity you carry, don't let it blind you to the danger of letting ghosts walk back through our doors." The child was given to a family. She ran. That's all. Lucinda stepped forward then. Slowly, her bare feet found the familiar cracks in the stone. She listened for the hollow sound under the flagstones near the well. She knew the plaza like she knew her mother's lullabies. It hadn't changed, but the people had. She stopped in the center, wrapped in Mary Elizabeth's blanket, chin lifted. "I didn't run," she said. "I was taken." Her voice was small, but it cut through the crowd like a knife through cloth. Simon didn't flinch, but his jaw worked harder than before. "I was sold," Lucinda continued, "like a sack of corn. Because Simon Harris lost money he couldn't repay." "She's confused," Simon said quickly. "You know how children are." "I heard you," she said. "I was behind the corn sacks in the storage barn. You were drunk. 3 men came in. You told them you didn't have silver or horses left. You said, 'Take the blind one.'" A low murmur swept through the plaza. Heads turned, eyes darted. "She lies," Simon snapped. "A child who's been gone for months shows up, dragging some wild Apache behind her, now makes up stories to win your sympathy." Arthur, the carpenter, stepped forward. His gray beard twitched as he cleared his throat. "Simon," he said, his voice steady, "what reason would she have to lie?" "To survive," Simon barked. "To gain favor." "To stay. She's 8, Arthur said. "She came back here alone, blind, half-starved. You think she plotted a lie that deep?" "She was raised by her mother," Simon growled, "a woman who never respected the law of this town." "That woman died tending crops that fed your family," Elena Vasquez said, moving to stand beside Arthur. Her dark braid hung long down her back, and she crossed her arms with purpose. "She never asked for charity. Just a chance to raise her daughter in peace." "She feared no one," Mary Elizabeth added, "and that frightened you." Simon's eyes narrowed. "This is turning into a trial of me when we should be focused on what's best for the town." "What's best for the town," Arthur said calmly, "is knowing who we've been following all these years." Lucinda stood quietly through the volley of voices. She turned toward where she heard Nantan step forward. "You told me," she said gently, "truth doesn't need belief. It just needs speaking." He nodded once, though she could not see it. He didn't interrupt. Lucinda reached into the blanket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were soft, worn from time and handling. She held it up toward the voices. "My mama left this," she said. "I couldn't read it. But Nantan did Simon's face turned pale. "What is that?" he demanded. "A letter," Lucinda said, "with her name, her father's name, and something about the valley lands." Arthur stepped forward and took the letter from her hands. He opened it carefully, squinting to read under the flickering lantern light, his mouth pressed into a thin line. "Well?" someone asked. Arthur looked at Simon, then to the rest of the crowd. "This says Maria Esperanza was the granddaughter of Don Carlos Mendoza." Another ripple of gasps and murmurs. "That can't be," Simon said, his voice cracking slightly. "Those lands were left to the territory." "No heirs, or so you claimed," Arthur replied. "I filed the paperwork myself. There were no living kin. Except the girl you sold," Mary Elizabeth said. Simon took a step back, his hands clenched. Elena turned to the crowd. "If this letter is real, and she's Mendoza's blood, then she owns a piece of the land Simon's been calling his." "I developed it," Simon said through gritted teeth. "I built fences, brought cattle, cleared the brush." "You stole it," Nantan said, his voice low but clear. The crowd stilled. "You stole a child's future," he continued. "And now that child is standing here, not asking for revenge." Just to be heard, Lucinda's hand trembled, still holding the string of her mother's necklace. Her knees shook beneath her dress, but her voice did not waver. "I came back to find out if the place I was born still had room for me." Arthur closed the letter and folded it carefully. "You didn't just come back, child," he said. "You came to wake this place up." Someone in the crowd began to clap, soft, awkward. Then another, then more. Simon's face was red with fury, but he stood frozen, eyes darting for an exit. Lucinda turned toward the chapel. "I know this plaza by sound," she said. "I know where the stones crack, where the bell swings, where my mother stood every Sunday holding my hand. I don't need to see to know I belong here." She paused, then said softly, "But I also know when someone is afraid." The silence that followed was thick. Nantan stepped behind her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. Simon didn't move, but his breathing had changed, faster, uneven, because he knew what was coming. The truth was no longer something whispered in corners. It was in the open now, and truth, once spoken, doesn't go quiet again. The letter sat in Arthur's hands, trembling just slightly, though the old carpenter's face remained carved from stone. The crowd held its breath. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if nature itself wanted to hear what had been hidden for so long. Nantan stepped forward. He took the paper gently from Arthur, turned it over once in his hand, then unfolded it with care. His voice, low and steady, carried easily across the plaza. "This letter was written by Maria Esperanza," he began. "She was Lucinda's mother. Died of fever 2 winters past." The letter was tucked inside a stitched pocket, sewn into the lining of Lucinda's coat. He glanced to Lucinda, who stood just behind him, her fingers curled around the pendant at her neck, like it was the last thing in the world she trusted. "The ink has faded in parts," Nantan continued, "but the message is clear. Maria was the granddaughter of Don Carlos Mendoza." Gasps rippled through the crowd. That name hadn't been spoken in Sentado for years, not since the land dispute that Simon Harris had used to elevate himself from cattle broker to headman. "That's a lie," Simon barked from the chapel steps. "There were no heirs. Don Carlos died without family. Everyone knows that." Nantan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The letter was signed by Don Carlos himself, years before he passed. He named Maria as his blood, and in absence of her, the inheritance would fall to her children. Elena Vasquez stepped forward, face pale but eyes sharp. "Don Carlos was your cousin, wasn't he, Simon? You told the council the Mendoza line ended in Spain. That's how you got the claim cleared." Simon's eyes darted, but his mouth stayed shut. Arthur crossed his arms. 5 years ago, you filed with the territorial judge. Said the land was abandoned, no heirs in sight. You had the cattle ready the next week. I invested in that land, Simon said, his voice rising. I made it useful. Built corrals, ran herds. That valley was dead before I took it. Dead to you, Mary Elizabeth said from the edge of the circle, but not to Maria. She used to take Lucinda there every spring, remember? Said it was the only place that felt like home after her parents died. Nantan held up the letter again. Under territorial law, this document stands. Unless someone can prove otherwise, the valley land belongs to Lucinda Esperanza Mendoza. You mean to give a blind child 1,000 acres? Simon shouted, now red-faced and shaking. She can't even walk without help, let alone run land. That land was never yours to run, Arthur said. Simon stepped off the chapel stairs. His boots hit the dirt with force, but the people around him didn't move. They didn't part to let him through. You want to throw me out over this? He hissed. You want to toss away everything I've done because of some Apache whispering lies and a child who doesn't know her left from her right. Lucinda spoke then, quiet but clear. I know the sound of your voice, Mr. Harris. I know it when it lies. The hush that followed made even the horses restless at the hitching posts. Simon turned in a slow circle, scanning the faces around him. And something in his stance shifted not power, but panic. For the first time, he looked small. I fed this town, he snapped. I gave it order. You sold a child to cover your gambling debt, Elena said coldly. That's not order. That's cowardice. Voices murmured in agreement, some loud, some barely audible. But they were rising. You all loved the land once I made it bloom, Simon tried again. You profited. You let me build, and now you want to turn on me for doing what had to be done. It didn't have to be done, Mary Elizabeth said. You just thought no one would speak. Simon's eyes landed on Lucinda. For one raw second, hate flickered there. A child had undone him with nothing more than the truth. Nantan stepped between them. Enough. The word was soft, but it cut sharper than anything Simon had said. He turned toward the crowd. My people believe in restoration, Nantan said. When a man causes harm, he must face it. Not just to repay what he stole, but to mend what was broken by the taking. And what does that look like? Arthur asked, his voice steady but roughened by age. Nantan looked to Lucinda. It begins by giving back what was stolen. The land, her name, her place. And then, Elena asked. He looked at the crowd, slowly, deliberately. Then you decide what kind of people you want to be. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was full of movement, minds shifting, eyes questioning, guilt surfacing. Some looked down. Others looked at Simon. A few looked at Lucinda, really looked at her, and saw more than a blind child. They saw a mirror. Because if Santiago had let a man sell a little girl and lie about her blood to steal what wasn't his, what did that make them? Simon backed away from the center of the crowd, step by step, as if the light had become too bright. But the town didn't follow. They stood still, held in the weight of the moment, and as the dust swirled low around their boots, one thing became clear to everyone watching. Truth had returned to Santado, and it was not leaving quietly. The plaza hadn't emptied. No one moved, not really. They stood scattered like driftwood after a flood stunned, quiet, faces marked by something heavier than anger. It was shame, the kind that settled deep and scratched at the ribs from the inside. Simon Harris had walked away. No one stopped him, but no one followed either. Lucinda sat on the edge of the well where the whole thing had begun. Her feet dangled just above the packed dirt, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't shaking anymore. Nantan stood beside her, not like a guard, like a witness. Arthur cleared his throat and stepped toward the well. Elena joined him, arms crossed but her face unreadable. Mary Elizabeth stood a few steps back, eyes shining but mouth firm. Nantan spoke first. "There's no law in my people's blood that applies here," he said slowly, "but there is something older than paper. When a child is wronged by hand or by silence, the tribe must name the harm and restore the one harmed." He looked across the crowd. "You want to talk about justice? Fine. Then justice must begin with truth. You let a man steal from a child, you let him steal her voice, her place, her name, and you said nothing. Some heads dropped. Others turned away. Arthur didn't. "What would restoration look like, Nantan?" he asked. "First, the land goes back," Nantan said without hesitation. "It was never Simon's to begin with. Lucinda's name is in that letter. It belongs to her by right, and the rest?" Arthur asked. Nantan's gaze didn't waver. "You all watched her disappear. Some of you knew how, some didn't ask. That kind of silence is a choice. You don't get to pretend it never happened." "Not anymore." Voices stirred, low and uneven. "I was told she went with a family in the next town," someone said. "I thought she'd been sent east," another added. "She was sold," Elena said flatly. "Let's stop dancing around it." Mary Elizabeth stepped forward then. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I can't change what was done," she said, "but I can change what happens next." She turned to Lucinda. "If you'll have me, child, my home is open, not as charity, as family." Lucinda's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Her hand reached for the well's edge again, grounding herself. After a beat, she nodded. Elena crossed her arms tighter. "She'll need more than one woman with good intentions." "She'll need a town that remembers how to care for its own," Arthur nodded, "and a place where her name isn't whispered like a problem." "You willing to help build that place?" Elena asked him. "I helped build every porch in this town," Arthur replied. "I've got enough wood left in me to build one more." The sound that followed wasn't quite applause. It was a kind of agreement, a murmur of heads nodding, feet shifting, shoulders loosening as if the truth had made room for breath again. "I can offer meals," called a woman from the back. "She can sit at our table." "My boys can help fix the barn," said another. "I got thread and wool." "I'll make her a new dress." It happened slowly. A ripple, a shift. And then the circle around the well became something else entirely. A place where the town, without Simon's voice controlling the wind, began to speak with its own. Lucinda turned toward the sounds, her face soft, unreadable, but her hands gripped the stone rim tightly, anchoring herself in the tide of voices that, for the first time, weren't aimed to push her away. Nantan stepped back, letting the moment belong to her. But even in the stillness he remained alert, like a man who had learned that peace was a rare bird that spooked easy. Mary Elizabeth crouched next to Lucinda, brushing back a strand of hair from the girl's cheek. "Is that all right, honey?" she asked. "To come home with me tonight?" Lucinda nodded. Her voice came like wind through dry grass. "It's more than all right." The plaza began to empty, slowly, one voice at a time. Some left silent. Some lingered, unsure of how to return to houses that had, until hours ago, ignored their own guilt. But they moved. Lucinda stood, one hand on Mary Elizabeth's shoulder. Nantan remained where he was, hands at his sides, jaw tight, eyes watching the horizon. Lucinda tilted her face toward him. "You're not coming with us?" He didn't answer. Mary Elizabeth glanced between them but said nothing. She simply touched Lucinda's back and waited. The girl stepped closer to Nantan, her feet dragging faint lines in the dust. "You helped me find my name again," she said softly. "You stayed." He nodded once. That was the right thing to do. She looked toward the hills beyond town. And now you'll leave. I don't belong here. Lucinda lifted her chin. What about me? She asked. Did I? He looked down at her then. The same question that haunted her now flickered behind his eyes. You belong now, he said. And you don't? Her voice cracked just a little. You were the first person who saw me. He looked away into the night. A long silence passed between them. Then Lucinda asked the question that had lived in her chest since the first moment he'd placed the blanket beside her at the well. What about you, Nantan? Where will you go? He didn't answer. Because truth didn't always come all at once. Sometimes it needed a little more time to find its voice. The valley stretched wide and gold in the late afternoon light, sagebrush scattered like old thoughts. The creek, swollen slightly from spring melt, whispered through cottonwoods lining its banks. Lucinda stood at the edge of the rise, the wind tugging gently at her dress. One hand held the walking stick Arthur had carved from desert mesquite. The other rested lightly on Nantan's arm. She couldn't see the land, but she felt it. The wind had a tone here, deeper, rounder, and the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. Behind her, Mary Elizabeth stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. Well, child, she said, you're home. Lucinda took a slow breath. I want to build something here, she said, not just for me. Arthur leaned on the post he'd carried up the hill, his hands resting on the top like he was steadying something larger than wood. You thinking of cattle? No, Lucinda said, shaking her head. People. Nantan didn't move, but Lucinda could feel the way his attention sharpened. I want this land to be a place for those who've been left behind, she said, like I was. A place where they don't have to prove they're worth keeping. Mary Elizabeth gave a small sound in her throat, half prayer, half sigh. A home, Arthur said simply. Lucinda nodded. A home that listens before it asks questions, that offers hands before judgment. She turned slightly toward the sound of the creek below. I want to call it Casa de los Sonidos. Arthur raised an eyebrow. The House of Sounds? Lucinda smiled faintly. Because that's how I know I'm safe. I don't see the world. I hear it. The rhythm of voices, the echo of laughter, the creak of steps on old wood. That's how I know when I belong. Mary Elizabeth's voice was thick with emotion. It's a beautiful name. Arthur pushed off the post and nodded. Then we better build it right. Over the next few days, word spread quietly through Santado. Not like gossip, more like a ripple in water, gentle and constant. A few men offered to help clear the old brush near the creek. Elena Vasquez brought over baskets of food without saying much. Roberto Morales, just turned 12 and full of questions, offered to help, if someone gave him a hammer that actually worked. Lucinda walked the land each morning with Nantan, counting paces and marking sounds. There was a patch where the wind changed pitch. She called it the listening corner. Another near a fallen sycamore where the birds gathered louder than anywhere else. This is where the kitchen should be, she told them one morning. I want to wake to the sound of cooking. Arthur laughed softly. You sure you're not part carpenter? She's something, Nantan murmured, watching her tap her stick along the dirt, stopping only when the ground changed beneath her feet. The first wall went up on a Tuesday. Thick adobe bricks made from clay pulled straight from the banks of the creek. They worked side by side, Arthur with his tools, Nantan mixing and lifting, Mary Elizabeth adjusting the frame of the doorway with the stubborn precision of someone who'd delivered babies in barns and cabins, and once in the back of a wagon during a lightning storm. Lucinda didn't build with her hands, not in the same way. But she directed. She listened. She traced the layout with her feet each night and adjusted it based on how the space sounded. The house began to rise with her memory and instinct shaping every inch. That night, they lit a fire in the middle of the unfinished room. The roof was still open to stars, and the smoke rose clean into the sky. Lucinda sat beside it, holding a cup of sweet tea Elena had insisted on brewing. "Feels like more than a house," Arthur said, staring into the flames. "It is," Nantan said. Lucinda turned toward their voices. "I want people to come here and remember that they matter," she said, even if they were told they didn't. Mary Elizabeth reached over and tucked a blanket around Lucinda's shoulders. "You think others will come?" she asked softly. Lucinda tilted her head. The wind was moving again, brushing across the clay walls, lifting ash from the fire. "They'll come," she said, "because I did." As the fire burned low and the stars brightened above them, a silence settled, not heavy this time, but expectant, like the land was listening too. Lucinda sat quietly, hearing the new bones of the house settle, the walls sighing as they dried, the wind circling through what would one day be bedrooms, kitchens, places where laughter could echo. Then she turned toward Nantan. "There's still room here," she said. "For who?" "For anyone who's been forgotten." Nantan stared into the fire for a long time, and in the darkness just beyond the rise, under the same stars that had once watched Simon Harris lie, the first footsteps of someone seeking shelter approached the valley edge. The first to arrive was Carmen. She came on foot, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, walking with the kind of determination that came from being hunted. Her eyes, sharp and dark, scanned the horizon constantly, but it was the way she kept one hand tucked under her ribcage, clutching something unseen, that caught Mary Elizabeth's attention as the woman stepped onto the edge of Casa de los Sonidos. Nantan met her first. He didn't speak at first, just stood there between her and the house, waiting. Carmen froze. "I'm not here to steal," she said in Spanish. "Good," Nantan replied in the same tongue. "We have nothing worth stealing, only worth staying for." She tilted her chin as if weighing his face against her past. Then she stepped forward. Mary Elizabeth came out with water. Carmen drank slowly, then looked past them both to where Lucinda sat, shaping wet clay beneath the half-finished awning of the workshop. "She's the one?" Carmen asked. "The blind girl they whisper about?" "I'm not blind," Lucinda said calmly from her stool. "I just see different." Carmen studied her, then nodded slowly, as if that answer was good enough. She stayed. The second to arrive came 4 days later, riding a sway-backed horse with no saddle and eyes that held too many winters. He called himself Windwalker. He didn't say where he'd come from, and no one asked. His skin was as weathered as the canyon walls, and his braids hung down over a faded army coat that had been patched too many times to count. Nantan knew him by reputation, not name. "You refuse to take up arms," Nantan said, standing beside the corral as the old man dismounted. "I refuse to be a pawn," Windwalker replied. They didn't speak again for an hour, just stood beside each other in silence, watching the valley breathe. When night fell, Windwalker unrolled a hide beneath a cottonwood and said, "I'll stay a while." No one told him otherwise. Then came the children. They arrived just after sunrise, escorted by the blacksmith from the next town over, who'd found them near the rail line, stealing apples from an abandoned wagon. 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. Their red hair marked them Irish, and their silence marked them as children who'd learned not to ask for anything they couldn't survive without. Lucinda met them with a bowl of warm corn stew and sat with them on the steps. She didn't ask names right away. She just sat. When the smallest, Katie, accidentally bumped Lucinda's arm and apologized in a whisper, Lucinda handed her a lump of clay. "You can shape it however you like," she said. "There's no wrong way." By dusk, the girl had molded a crooked little cat. Lucinda smiled. "You've got hands that see." The other two children didn't speak for 2 days. But when Nantan let them help feed the goats, and Mary Elizabeth showed them where the rainwater was stored for drinking, they slowly began to settle. Arthur, who'd come by to repair the porch beam, started whittling a flute and gave it to the middle boy without a word. The boy played one note, badly, then grinned for the first time since arriving. That night the dining table overflowed. The house wasn't finished, still missing one corner wall and half a roof over the back rooms, but they sat together anyway. Carmen offered a song from her hometown. Windwalker told a story about coyotes who outwitted soldiers. The children watched it all with wide eyes and full bellies. Lucinda sat at the end of the table, her head tilted to catch every sound. Her hands were raw from shaping clay all day, but her heart was light. Nantan watched her as the laughter rose, as bread was passed and stew ladled, as the fire cracked and warm air filled the rafters. She turned toward him once and said, "It's happening, isn't it?" He nodded. "They're coming. All of them. The ones who have nowhere else." He looked around the room. "Not just them." "Us too," Lucinda smiled. "We're becoming something." Nantan said nothing, but the firelight caught in his eyes, and for once he didn't look like a man ready to leave. Later that night, Lucinda sat with the children in the workshop. Katie sat beside her, trying to copy the way Lucinda rolled the clay into small bowls. "You can't see?" the girl asked softly. Lucinda nodded. "Not with my eyes." "But you can make things." Lucinda handed her a bowl. "So can you." The other children watched, quiet but present. Lucinda leaned forward and whispered, "The world told us we don't belong anywhere. But the world forgot we can make a place of our own." In the darkness outside, someone approached the house. Slow steps, cautious breathing, the sound of someone not sure if they'd be welcome. Lucinda turned her head slightly, catching the shift in the air. Another soul, broken or afraid, had found their way to the valley. And tomorrow there would be another chair at the table. It was Roberto who found it. The boy had been poking around the ruins of the old chapel again, despite Mary Elizabeth's warnings and Windwalker's growled stories about ghosts and snakes. The building had been left to rot after the flood 15 years ago took out its south wall. Now it stood as a husk-crumbling adobe, splintered pews, weeds growing up through cracked stone tiles. But Roberto didn't scare easy. He had a habit of going where he wasn't supposed to, and this time he'd squeezed behind the altar stones, chasing the idea of arrowheads he'd heard were sometimes hidden in the walls. Instead, he found a corner where the plaster sounded hollow. He didn't shout for help right away. He just picked at the edge, careful not to break anything more than he had to. When a piece of clay fell loose and hit the ground with a strange metallic thud, his breath caught. By the time he pried the shape free and saw the silver glint under layers of dust, his hands were shaking. He ran straight to Casa de los Sonidos, waving it in the air and shouting for Father Miguel. The priest, who had been hammering nails into the new chapel frame with Arthur, stopped mid-swing. One look at the boy's face and he dropped the hammer. Lucinda was sitting under the porch awning, shaping another clay dish with Katie. She turned her head toward the noise. "I found something," Roberto gasped, breathless. "In the wall. Behind the altar. I don't know what it is, but it's heavy and it feels important." Father Miguel took the object with reverence, brushing off the dirt. His eyes widened as the shape revealed itself, ornate, old, and unmistakably sacred. "It's a cross," he whispered. He held it up, and the silver caught in the morning light. Lucinda reached for it. Father Miguel hesitated, then guided her hands to the smooth metal. She ran her fingers over the shape-long arms, curved slightly, symbols etched deep into its surface. Her brow furrowed as she traced each line. "There are birds," she murmured, and vines. And here, Christ, but the lines are shallow now. Father Miguel nodded slowly, almost forgetting she couldn't see the expression. This was hidden for a reason, he said. Protected. From who? Arthur asked. Or from what? Time, Lucinda answered. It waited until we were ready to see it together. No one spoke after that for a moment. Then Mary Elizabeth stepped forward, brushing her hands on her apron. Well, she said, voice soft, then we better give it a place to be seen. They cleaned the cross carefully, polishing it with soft cloth and warmed water. The writing Latin, faint and worn, confirmed what Father Miguel suspected. The cross had been blessed by Bishop Montoya in 1698. That made it one of the oldest religious artifacts in the territory, and somehow it had waited, buried inside stone and silence until now. By the week's end, Arthur and Roberto had finished framing the new chapel at Casa de los Sonidos. It wasn't fancy simple adobe walls, a wooden arch, a bell that clanged more than chimed, but it had heart. Windwalker had etched symbols from his people's prayer language into the back beam. Carmen had embroidered curtains for the side windows. Even the Irish children had helped, sweeping dust and arranging hand-carved benches inside. The cross was placed at the front, not locked behind glass, not nailed high where it couldn't be touched, but set low on a wide cedar pedestal where anyone could reach it. Where hand-scarred, calloused, young, old, could remember. Lucinda stood beside it on the morning they opened the doors. She ran her fingers over the silver again, smiling. It feels like it belongs, she said. It does, Father Miguel replied. And so do you. The townspeople of Santado came out slowly that morning, one family at a time. Some brought baked bread, others brought flowers. One woman came with nothing but a song she'd sung as a child in the old chapel. It was quiet at first, but as they stepped inside, saw the cross, and felt the air clean, still unburdened by old grudges, something changed. No one had to say it. They all knew. This wasn't just a building. This was the beginning of something sacred, not because of the relic, but because of the way they had found it together. At sunset, Lucinda sat on the steps outside, listening to the new sounds of a place being reborn. Laughter inside the walls, footsteps soft on the floorboards, voices not in argument but in conversation. She tilted her head, feeling the way the air hummed through the cedar doorway. "You hear that?" she asked. Nantan stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the sky turn orange. Hear what? The sound of people remembering they can be good. He didn't smile, not quite, but the corners of his eyes softened. "You gave them something to believe in," he said. Lucinda shook her head. "No. We just showed them what was already here." They chose the rest. Behind them, Katie and Roberto chased each other around the new benches, laughter echoing. Windwalker sat on a bench carving a new flute, his back to the wall. Carmen swept dust from the walkway, humming something quiet and hopeful. Lucinda turned her face toward the wind and whispered, "It waited for us." In the dark hills beyond the valley, a rider paused on the trail, watching the soft lantern light flicker through chapel windows. They stayed hidden just for a moment longer, deciding if this place was real or just another dream. Tomorrow they'd step out of the shadows and test the sound of welcome for themselves. The wind that rolled through the valley that spring didn't sting the way it used to. It carried warmth now and color. Wildflowers bloomed across the hills like spilled paint lilac, gold, fire red. The peach trees had returned to blossom. The earth, once cracked and withdrawn, had softened enough to give. Casa de los Sonidos stood in the center of it all, no longer just a place of shelter but a pulse, a rhythm, the kind that grows in the bones and settles in the chest, the kind of rhythm that says, "You belong here." Lucinda stood in the middle of the open garden with her hands in the dirt. She couldn't see the way the marigolds tilted toward her, or the curve of the vines climbing the wooden frame above her head. But she could feel everything else, the hum of bees, the press of sun on her skin, the laughter of children ringing off the chapel's clay walls. It had been 1 year since they laid the first brick. Now 5 adobe homes stood neatly spaced across the land, each built by the hands of those who lived within them. Carmen had opened a weaving shop near the edge of the orchard. Windwalker had built a stone circle for stories and songs. The 3 Irish siblings had a small classroom where they taught letters and numbers to the younger children who arrived each month. Even the air had changed, no longer wary, no longer bruised, just breathing. Mary Elizabeth joined Lucinda by the rows of new garden beds, carrying a basket of lavender. "Guess what Arthur said this morning," she began without preamble, brushing hair back from her face. "He's thinking of adding goats." Lucinda smiled, leaning on her cane. "He's been thinking about goats for months." "Well, now he says it out loud. That means it's serious." They both laughed. It was a soft, full sound, the kind you only hear when people have been through something hard and made it out together. Nantan stepped up from the west trail, a leather notebook in hand, his shadow long behind him. "I walked the perimeter again," he said, "the fence lines still holding. No tracks where they shouldn't be. Good," Mary Elizabeth nodded. "Last thing we need is another coyote dragging off laundry." He shook his head. "I'm more worried about men than coyotes." Lucinda tilted her head. "You heard something?" Nantan looked toward the horizon, where the land blurred into heat waves. Words starting to spread. "What we're doing here, who we're taking in. Not everyone likes it." Mary Elizabeth tensed. "We haven't had trouble in months." "Yet," he said plainly, "but we need to think ahead." Lucinda ran her fingers across the edge of a cedar planter, letting the grain of the wood settle her nerves. "You're right." It's time they walked together to the shaded porch outside the main house, where blue jays darted between wind chimes. The air smelled of sage and clay. "We've built something good here," Mary Elizabeth said as they sat down, "but it's not enough." Lucinda nodded. "Because there are more like us. Out there, on trains, in canyons, hiding behind old barn doors, hoping no one sees how lost they really are. Women running from fists and fathers. Children no one claimed. Old men who forgot how to speak their names out loud," Nantan added, voice quiet. "And none of them need saving," Lucinda said. "They just need reminding." "Reminding of what?" Mary Elizabeth asked. Lucinda turned her face to the sunlight, breathing deep. "That they are not a burden. That healing is not shame. That a home doesn't have to be earned through suffering." They were silent a moment. Then Lucinda straightened. "We expand CASA." Mary Elizabeth looked surprised. "How?" "We've got limited hands, no extra supplies. We ask for help," Lucinda said, simple as breath. "We tell the truth. Let them see us for what we are, a sanctuary, not a secret." Nantan didn't answer at first. Then he opened the leather notebook and turned it toward them. On the page were rough sketches, more homes, a larger gathering hall, a river-fed irrigation trench. "You've already started," Mary Elizabeth whispered. He shrugged. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes." Lucinda reached out and laid a hand over the drawing. "I say yes," she said, "with every brick we've laid. With every meal we've shared, with every broken voice that sang again inside these walls." They sat for a long time that afternoon, planning, arguing over details, laughing at mistakes, dreaming bigger than they had before. When the sun began to dip behind the hills, the sky turned gold and the fields shimmered. Lucinda stood, feeling the warmth on her skin, the peace in her chest. She turned to them both, her voice strong and steady. "Now," she said, "it's time to help others find the sound of home." From behind them came the faint creak of wagon wheels. Someone new was arriving. And this time they weren't coming in fear. They were coming because they'd heard the sound, and they wanted to believe it was real. The stars above Casa de los Sonidos shimmered like shards of ice, scattered across the dark velvet of a high desert sky. Snow had fallen that morning, light and powdery, just enough to coat the adobe rooftops and soften the creak of the windmill. Now, on Christmas Eve, the valley lay quiet under a hush that felt sacred, a hush earned. Inside the main house, warmth radiated from the hearth. Pine logs crackled. The scent of cinnamon, wood smoke, and fresh bread lingered in every room. Someone strummed a guitar softly in the distance, probably young Jessie, whose fingers had grown skilled after months of patient lessons from Nantan. Laughter floated in from the kitchen, pots clanged, boots thudded, children whispered secrets. Lucinda sat in her old rocking chair, the one she'd chosen by feel in the carpenter's shop months ago. Its curved wood fit her perfectly. A soft quilt lay over her lap. Curled against her chest, small and sleepy, was Katie, now 3 years old, heavier than she used to be, but still impossibly light when she snuggled into Lucinda like this, all breath and wonder. "Is it almost time?" Katie whispered, eyes half closed. Lucinda smiled. "For what?" "For the story," the girl yawned. "The one about the sounds." Lucinda leaned back, the chair creaking just enough to join the music of the room. She rested her chin atop Katie's curls, warm and wild. "Well," she began, "the sound of a real family is never just one thing. It's the rhythm of many hearts choosing each other. It's the scraping of chairs across a kitchen floor, the hum of bread rising in an oven, the thump of little feet running barefoot down a hallway. It's the voice that calls your name with care, even when you've done something foolish." Katie giggled softly. Lucinda continued, "It's laughter that fills empty rooms. It's a guitar played not to impress, but to heal. It's someone chopping wood before sunrise just because they know the morning will be cold." "And the wind?" Katie murmured. "Is that part of it?" "Oh, yes," Lucinda said, "especially the wind. Because when everything else is quiet, the wind carries memories. And if you listen closely, it'll tell you that you're never alone." Katie was asleep before the last word left Lucinda's lips. Her tiny hand clutched the edge of Lucinda's shawl, like she was holding on to the story itself. The fire cracked again. Mary Elizabeth passed through the room, pausing to tuck the quilt higher on Katie's back. She didn't speak, just smiled, then returned to the gathering outside. Through the open window came the voices of those who had stayed, those who had chosen love over fear. Windwalker singing in Apache, Carmen's rich alto joining in, the Irish children clapping along in rhythm, Roberto reading scripture in Spanish beside the newly blessed chapel. A year ago, this valley had held only echoes of pain and exile. Now it was alive. Simon Harris, once the voice of authority in these parts, had long since been cast out. Officially, he had resigned due to scandal. Unofficially, he had fled in shame after the federal inquiry revealed his dealings with land speculators and his abuses of power. No town wanted him. No title could hide him. But Casa remained, and it flourished. They had planted roots in earth that once rejected them, and still, somehow, the land had answered with mercy. Almond trees grew where none had before. The well water ran sweet, and even the wolves in the canyon gave the village a wide, respectful berth. Lucinda kissed Katie's forehead, then gently passed her to Nantan, who appeared without a word to lift the girl and carry her to bed. She stood with effort, gripping her cane, and stepped out onto the porch. The moon glazed everything silver. Smoke drifted upward in lazy ribbons from chimneys. Beyond the gathering hall, someone lit paper lanterns, their orange glow bobbing in the dark like small floating suns. Lucinda breathed deep. The sounds of this place, the soft singing, the laughter, the scrape of a broom on stone rose around her like a benediction. She turned her face to the wind. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the broken bell that had called her, for the wrong turn that was never wrong at all, for the pain that hollowed her, and the people who filled her again. She had once believed her world had gone dark forever. Now, even without sight, she saw more clearly than she ever had before. She saw through sound, through love, through choice. The wind stirred again, brushing against her cheeks like a hand. It carried the scent of snow and something else, something older, quieter, a promise not yet spoken, a chapter not yet written. She smiled. Behind her the lanterns swayed gently. The chapel's new cross caught the moonlight. Inside, the warmth of family waited. And somewhere, far beyond the valley, others would hear what Lucinda once heard, a sound that wasn't a scream or a sob or a siren, but the sound of home, calling someone else next. So don't miss what comes after this, because the wind never stops moving and neither does the story. Subscribe to Western Legacy. Another tale rides in with tomorrow's dawn.